Welcome everyone to our monthly interview. We are here with Miss Chassidy. She works for the Fort Bend Independent School District. So would you mind just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chassidy Olainu-Alade. I am the coordinator of community and civic engagement in Fort Bend ISD, as Alexandra mentioned. My role is super unique and important as I assist the district with sort of being the steward of civic engagement and finding ways to connect to the community in various capacities. Specifically related to civic engagement, I lead some major initiatives for the district. One of them is high school student voter registration. And so that's a really fun project that over the past few years, we have had to be innovative. I actually started this role right at the beginning of COVID. And I knew like high school student voter registration was a law, but I'm like, well, how do we abide by the law if there's no school? And so we had to work to create some new systems during that sort of remote learning, which we actually distributed over the course of 2 years, over 8,000 birthday cards to students approaching 18 that included a voter registration application. So that was really cool. In addition to that, just working to develop systems to help support our high school administrators in making sure that on a monthly or quarterly basis that they provide our students who are approaching 18 with an opportunity to register to vote in a public school setting. So that's one specifically related to civic engagement. The other is, Texas election code, Texas state education code has several requirements that relate to civic engagement that in many cases kind of get offloaded onto like social studies curriculum or department, which in a lot of cases they get lost. So in the case of Fort Bend ISD, what I do is sort of centralize some of these legislative pieces to make sure that we have fidelity and implementation. One of those being the Community Safety Education Awareness Act. Have you ever heard of that?
Personally, no.
It is, you may remember, it's called Peaceful Interactions with a Police Officer. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yes. So that was a law that was passed that requires all students to kind of interact with a module of information that teaches them how to engage with a peace officer during a traffic stop. Again, it's a graduation requirement. And so we got the legislation, which gave very little guidance in 2018. And so for the past 4 years, we've been working to take that small amount of guidance and create a full-blown implementation plan to, again, help our administrators making sure that we're in compliance. So that's most of the work on the civic engagement side that I do in the district, but then I also liaise with our local government entities, the county, both of our cities, to advance their own initiatives related to students or youth civic engagement. So that looks like whether it's mentoring for a youth leadership program, assisting with a voter registration drive, assisting with like emergency relief drives, those sort of things on the civic engagement side of my work.
You do a lot of work. That's really good. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Would you mind explaining kind of how you got involved in this? Like maybe the career path you took for people looking into something similar?
Of course. So I will summarize it in like social studies as a field of studies was always my favorite. I mean, in from elementary school all the way to high school, social studies was my favorite subject. And I used to kind of get some kickback. I'm like, oh, social studies, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to be a history professor? Like, what do what can you possibly do with that? And I was okay with the fact that being a teacher was most likely going to be my calling. And it was a passion. Teaching is something that I think everyone should do at some phase in their life. And so I just pursued my passion, which was social studies. But in being a social scientist, my favorite parts of it were actually using the knowledge and the academia to apply it to real life situations and work. So what that translates to is I always tried to find opportunities to be engaged in my community because I was very much so aware that history impacts the past and the future, and then government and economics, all of these things are intertwined. You can't dissect that. So I found myself doing a lot of volunteer work in the community. I also was part of a youth leadership organization in my hometown. So it's subliminally, I feel like my youth prepared me for this career path, even though I didn't even know that this was a career opportunity 20 some odd years ago, right? I went to college to be a teacher. Um, actually, I started with law, then I switched to philosophy, and I was like, back to education. So I tried to fight it, but eventually I just said, no, I'm going to be a teacher. So I graduated with a degree in secondary education, focusing on history and social studies. And then I became a teacher. And then shortly after, I got a master's in secondary education with an emphasis on history and multicultural education. Because again, this whole like culture, geography, like it's just a heightened awareness that you have of the world. And so I love to study equity and inclusion and things of that nature. So that's how that was. I was a teacher for many years, and then I moved into the curriculum side of work. And as the curriculum coordinator, I gravitated to these extra projects that I kind of took on as other duties as assigned, which was voter registration because it was important to me. Again, I just knew that it was important. And then all the other pieces of legislation kind of came down to the point where the district recognized that there was a greater need to put a real emphasis on the work, being that, you know, we're extremely diverse, we're fast growing, we're a very civically engaged community in Fort Bend. And so it was a natural need that was determined. And so that's kind of how this career path started, just feeling a need and making sure that I built myself up with the proper skills and life experiences along the way.
That's really interesting. I really didn't know it was a career option until I met you, so it's nice to hear about that. You kind of touched on when you were younger, you did like youth leadership programs and volunteering. So, would you mind kind of expanding upon what you did? And do you have like any ideas for people who want to be more involved but don't really know what to do?
Of course. So the easiest path is joining existing initiatives or organizations, right? So whenever, and I was from a pretty active family, right? And so like I'm from South Louisiana, so whenever there was like a storm or a natural disaster, like we always just kind of naturally pitched in. Once you start to do those things, you see the value of community, right? And then you also start to meet people like elected officials, and you start to see that all of these things are really intertwined, right? And so it kind of started with that, using natural opportunities. My dad was part of like Rotary clubs and, you know, organizations. So I was very much so aware growing up. My parents took me to the voting booth for every election. So voting wasn't some like abstract thing. Voting has just been a natural practice. But I recognize that that's not everyone's life experiences. So the starting point for me would be to really dial into your interest and find groups that already exist that one could then join to sort of like cultivate their own experiences and really kind of build your skill set, your knowledge base for what the mission and the vision of that group is, right? Knowing that the group has a outcome. They're working for a purpose for the greater good of the community. So that's the first step. Find a group that already exists, join it. Then you can be like me and say, well, okay, I was a part of this group and yeah, we accomplished these things, but it's not enough because I see that this is a need. So I'm going to take on the charge myself. So you see that being part of an effort, often like leaders rise to the top, right? And so then you find yourself leading and saying, well, this is great. I'll be a member of this group, but I want to start my own initiative or I want to launch my own project. And so that's kind of where I found myself is saying, well, this is great, but we need to have a park in our neighborhood. We don't have a park in our neighborhood. So what do we do to create a park? right? And so starting to do the work and then talking to folks who might have the information, putting it together, knowing that you could go to a city council meeting or a school board meeting and present your plan. And most people don't know that, right? And so finding ways to kind of create your own initiatives. And once you do that, you're naturally going to be recognized by people. And so then that's how like I got invited to be part of a mayor's youth initiative, because I had attended a teen summit and then I was the person who kept like raising my hand, right? And so then the next year I got invited to be on the panel at the teen summit, and then eventually I got invited to be part of the mayor's youth organization, right? And so it's really just chasing the breadcrumbs in order to put yourself in a position where you really can make an impact in your community.
That's very important. I'm really like you. I always like to be involved, but I feel like once you start, it's never really enough. Like you always want to do a little more.
Mm-hmm.
So, what would you say to people who feel like just because they're younger, they don't really make a difference, or just because they're in something, they don't really have value? What would you say to them?
Oh, I would say that that is a really big misconception. I think adults often consult with young people for fresh ideas and new opinions, even when young people don't realize that they're being consulted. Um, I think the voice of youth is very important, particularly when you're looking at leadership, because you all give insight on what the future will be like. Not everybody likes what you all have to say, but it's always telling, right? And so I think that's a misconception that a lot of young people have is, oh, well, I'm only 15 or I'm only 16, I'm only 20. No, like your voice is your power and you just have to learn how to use it, whether it's the power of the pen. Some people don't like to like be speakers, right? They rather write letters. Yes, you can write a letter. Writing a letter is powerful. You just need to know who's the right person to send it to. And sometimes you have to send that letter to like 500 people before it gets into the right hands. So there's a degree of persistence that I think young people often don't have because we live in a very like quick, instant gratification sort of society as a whole. So young people say, oh, I tried. I sent an email and I didn't get a response. Well, did you send another email? Did you send a read receipt with the email? And like maybe you need to send an email and a written letter and show up at their office, right? And so is a level of persistence and grit that anybody, young or old, needs to have. But I think that's really the error in the thoughts of the young mindset is, oh, well, I don't have a voice, or that's too hard. That's going to take a lot of work, or I said something and no one responded, right? Sometimes it's not instant gratification. Sometimes like you can throw out an idea and think nobody heard it. And then like 3 months later, a year later, 2 years later, you're like, wait, I proposed that or I mentioned that, right? So I think if you don't say anything, you're never going to make a difference. If you don't do anything, you'll never make a difference. So versus, saying, oh, I'm not going to make a difference, why not just try?
I definitely agree with that. I know even myself sometimes falls into those traps of like, what can I do? But that was really important to hear. So just to wrap up a little bit, how would you say your position and just in general your life experiences have shaped your ideas and opinions on our role in government and just democratic processes in general?
Oh, I think they've made all the difference because I've been able to be a bystander in the democratic process as a young person who wasn't able to vote and seeing like the ramifications of people's choices. And then when I was able to vote, and there was that moment where I was like, I'm voting and it doesn't make a difference, right? And then you start to understand like the impact is actually closer the closer you are to the government entity. And so that shifted my whole viewpoint of like national government to local government. But now as I get older, I'm starting to see how it's just big web, and how no, it's cliche, but no voice, no vote. no vote, no voice. Like, voting is the single most important action we can take, because even if the person that you choose or the proposition that you voted for or against doesn't go in your favor, it tells you like where society is. And if you can't it's like a roadmap. It helps you navigate where things are. And um that's really important. But then also, I keep going back to this emphasis on community. Community is extremely important. um and again, we live in a very fast paced, isolated, we just came out of COVID where everyone was stuck in their house, right? And so the idea that people actually need a community to sustain is so like foreign to us. But my hope is that the more people get involved, they see the importance of community. I mean, close knit communities, high functioning communities, communities that are able to have like tough conversations, civil discourse. Um, they sustain and they bounce back in hard times faster than others, right? And so that's my life experiences have taught me those two things: community first, and invest in your community. If you invest in your community will invest in you. And two, vote if you have an opportunity to.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all those words of wisdom. I definitely appreciate it, and I know hopefully someone will really resonate with that and learn a lot from it. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, Alexandra. I really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you for your time.